Hello and welcome back. So in the last lecture, we added NgRx router state in our Angular application, and we also created a router state which is mapped to the router reducer. So if I go to VS Code, here in the appstate.ts file, we added this router property to our app state interface, and to this app reducer, which is acting as our store. There we have added a router state which is mapped to the router reducer. And because of this, if I go to our application and if I open developer console, basically if I open this Redux dev toolkit, so there is something which is going wrong. Let me reload this page. All right, let's log in here. So I'm going to log in john@gmail.com, and the password for this user is test1234. Let's log in this user, and after login, the user has been redirected to home page. Let's go to courses page, and from there let me select a course. Maybe I'll select the details of this course. And now we have been redirected to this URL. All right. And here, let me also show you the state. So you will see that in this state tree, we also have a router state. In that, we have two properties, the state property and the navigation ID property. So this navigation ID is basically the ID of the navigation. And if I expand this state, there you will have all the details related to the currently active route. So for example, you can see the URL for the currently active route is /courses/course/ the ID of the course. If I want to get the route parameters from this URL, I can expand this route. In there, I will have to go to first child. Then this first child has its own first child. So I will have to expand that. And in there, I have this params object, which will store all the route parameters for that particular route. Currently, for this route, we have only one route parameter, which is ID. So I can find that route parameter here with the current value. Okay, so as you can see here, we are storing the router state data in our NgRx store. But the problem here is this router state data, first of all, it is very huge. It has a lot of information, and all these informations is not required in our Angular application. Okay, so if we keep all this data in our state, it can impact the performance of our Angular application. And second, if I want to get, let's say, the route parameter from the current route, I will have to traverse into router tree. So this router has a state, the state has this root property. In that root property, I have a first child property. That first child property has its own first child property. And in that first child property, I have the route parameters. I have the data which is coming with the route. You can also see the URL. So as you can see, this URL is an object. If I expand that, this URL, it has two paths. First, so this is the URL root_URL/courses. In that, we have the first part, which is course. So that is the first element in this URL array. Okay. And the second part is this ID value. So that is the second element of this URL array. Then here you can also see the query parameters. For this route, we do not have any query parameter. But if I add any query parameter here, for example, edit equals true. Okay. And now let's select this latest action. And now let me expand this route. So in there we have the state. Let's expand route. Let's expand first child. And now you can see we also have this query params. Okay, if I expand this first child, there we can see the route parameter and we can see the query parameter. So for this URL, we have one query parameter which is edit and its value is true. So we can see that query parameter as well. So here, in order to get the route parameter or the query parameter, or let's say the current URL, we will have to traverse a lot in this router state. And the second thing is this router state is already storing a lot of data which can impact the performance of our application. So what we are going to do is, instead of having all this router data in the router state, we are only going to take those router state data which we might need in our Angular application. So instead of having all the router state data, we are going to serialize some of the router state data. and we are only going to keep that in the router state. Let's see how we can do that. For that, let's go to VS Code. Here, let me go ahead and let me close these files for now. We don't want them for now. Okay, and what I'm going to do is, so in this store, I'm going to create a new folder and I'll call it as router. And in that router folder, I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call it as custom-serializer.ts. Okay, this is going to be a TypeScript file. In this TypeScript file, I'm going to create and export an interface. Okay, I'm going to call it as router state. Okay, or maybe router state URL. All right, and in here, I'm going to specify what data I need from the router state. So I want to have the URL, which is going to be of type string. I want to have params, which is going to be of type params. And to use this params, we need to import it from angular/router. Okay, and I also want to have query params. So I'm going to call it as query params. And this is also going to be of type params. And we need to import it from angular/router. Now what we need to do is, now we are going to create and export a class. And I'm going to call this class as Custom Serializer. Again, you can name this class anything, but this custom initializer must implement from RouterStateSerializer. Okay, so RouterStateSerializer. So here I'm creating a custom serializer, and to create a custom serializer, it must implement the RouterStateSerializer. Okay, and here we also need to specify that what type of data the serializer will contain. So in the serialized data, I only want to have URL, params, and query params. So for the type, I'm going to specify the type as router state URL. Okay. Now, since this class is implementing from router state serializer, this forces us to implement the serialize method for this class. So here we are going to implement the serialize method. Also remember that this serialize method, it should return a router state URL. As you can see, the return type for this method is router state URL. Basically, whatever object we will return from this serialize method, it should have only these three properties. Now, to get the body for the serialize method, I'm going to go to the documentation of NgRx, and here I have opened NgRx router store. There I will go to configuration, and in here you can check this configuration options. Basically, here we want to serialize the router state data. For that, we are implementing this serializer method. So here you can see this serializer tells how a router snapshot is serialized. Now here, if I scroll down, you can see here we have an example of how we can implement this serialize method. So what I'm going to do is, I'm simply going to copy this content from here and we will paste it inside our serialize method. And let me format the code here. And here we have an error. If I hover over it, it says that this member cannot have override modifier because its containing class, the custom serializer, does not extend another class. So maybe I'll remove this override method from here. It was automatically added, so I kept it. Now, what are we doing here? Here, first of all, we are creating a variable called route, and we are assigning this variable with the router state dot root property. So we have seen that the router state has a root property which contains all the router state data. So we are extracting that root object and we are assigning it to this route variable. Now that root object also has a first child property, which in turn can have another first child property, and which in turn can have its own first child property. So using this while loop, we are going to the innermost first child property. Okay, and when the innermost first child property is found, we are assigning it to this route variable again. And then here we are using object destructuring syntax. So what we are doing here is we are getting the URL from the router state. So this router state will have a URL property. We are reading the value of that URL property and assigning it to this URL variable. Then this router state will also have a root property, which is an object, and that object will have a QueryParams property. So here we are reading the value of that QueryParams property and we are assigning it to this QueryParams variable. So this is nested destructuring syntax, because here inside an object we are destructuring another object. Okay, so this is nested destructuring of object. Then we are also destructuring the params from this route. Okay, so we have got the URL, we have got the params, and we have got the query params. And now what we need to do is we need to use this custom serializer to only serialize these three properties from the router state. For that, we can go to app module, where we are importing this StoreRouterConnectingModule, and on that we are calling this for root method. Here we can pass an object, and here we can specify serializer. And to this serializer, we are going to assign our custom serializer. So here we have our custom serializer, and to use it we also need to import it. And with this, if we save this and if we go to our application now, and now if we check this router state, if I expand it, there we have the state property, and if I expand that state, now you will see that we have only three properties. We have the URL property, which tells the current URL. Okay, so here we also have this edit query parameter, which is set to true because we have specified it in the URL. Then you will see this params property, which is an object, and in that object we have all the route parameters. Currently for this route we have only one route parameter, which is ID, and that route parameter with its current value you will find it in the params object. And then we also have the query parameters, this query params property, which is also an object, and in that object you will find all the query parameters which we have specified in the route. Currently we have specified only one query parameter, which is edit, so you can see that with its current value. So in this way we have serialized the router state data, and now in the router state we have only three properties: the URL, the route parameters, and the query parameters. And now wherever we want to use the route parameters or the query parameters or the URL in our Angular application, we can simply read it from the router state, and this router state is available in our NgRx store. So for example, let me close this. So if I go to our application, and there if I open the course detail, so here let me go to course detail component.ts. Here, in order to read this ID route parameter, what we are doing is we are using an instance of ActivatedRoute, and on that we are using the snapshot property. On that snapshot property we are using this param map property to get the value of this ID route parameter. But now what we can do is we can read this ID route parameter from this router state. So from here I can read the ID route parameter value. So if I go to courses page, let me remove everything from here, and let's directly go to courses page. Okay, and here let's go to this Node.js course. So I will open the details of this Node.js course. Right now, if I open this router state, there you will see this params, and in that param I have this ID property where this is the ID value. And if you see, this ID value is exactly same as this ID value which we are seeing here. So now we can read the value of this ID property of this params object from the router state in this component. So here we will not need this activated route instance. Instead, we can read the value of this ID property from the router state. We will see how we can do that in our next lecture. This is all from this lecture. If you have any questions from this lecture, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.